It is the spring of 1944. The war in Europe is entering its most decisive phase. Hundreds of thousands of lives hang in the balance of the next few months. The Allied command knows that to defeat Nazi Germany, they will need to cross the English Channel, punch through Hitler's Atlantic Wall, and fight their way across France. They also know that the Germans will see them coming. Unless 1,100 men, armed with nothing heavier than a machine gun, equipped with inflatable rubber tanks, a library of sound effects, and the imaginations of trained artists, could convince the entire German army that the Allies were somewhere they weren't. These men were called the Ghost Army, and for 50 years after the war ended, nobody was allowed to know they existed. This is the story of the most creative, the most audacious, maybe the most magnificently strange secret unit in American military history. A unit that included future fashion icons, legendary painters, and a sound engineer who could make a German general hear an entire tank division that wasn't there. A unit that may have saved the lives of as many as 30,000 American soldiers. And a unit that, when the war ended, went home, put on their civilian clothes, and were ordered never to speak about what they'd done. To understand why the Ghost Army existed, you first have to understand the fundamental problem facing the Allied command in 1944. The Allies had an enormous army, millions of men, tens of thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, aircraft, and ships. But enormous armies have a problem. They're visible. You can't hide 1,000,000 men. You can't disguise a fleet. And the Germans, whose intelligence apparatus was sophisticated, whose aerial reconnaissance was relentless, and whose defensive positions along the coast of France were heavily fortified, knew how to read troop movements. So the Allied planners faced a question that had no clean military answer. How do you make the enemy look in the wrong direction when everything you do is visible? The British had already begun developing an answer. In 1942, in the deserts of North Africa, a British unit faced off against one of Germany's most brilliant commanders, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, nicknamed the Desert Fox for his uncanny ability to read and anticipate Allied movements. Rommel was preparing for a major battle near a place called El Alamein in Egypt, and the British, rather than trying to outfight him outright, decided to outthink him. When they disguised their tanks as trucks, they moved real supply depots and hid them under camouflage nets. Then they built fake supply depots, enormous decoy installations made of wood and canvas, exactly where they wanted Rommel to look. They laid fake pipeline infrastructure to suggest the attack would come from one direction, and they made sure that every piece of information Rommel received confirmed the fiction they were building. The operation was called Operation Bertram, and it worked almost perfectly. Rommel's forces were caught off guard, positioned in the wrong place, and the British won one of the turning point victories of the entire North African campaign. Two American military planners in London were watching, and they started asking a very interesting question. On which their names were Colonel Billy Harris and Major Ralph Ingersoll, and they made a fascinating pair. Harris was West Point through and through, structured, disciplined, meticulous, a military man to his bones. Ingersoll was almost the exact opposite. He was a journalist, the managing editor of The New Yorker, publisher of Fortune magazine, founder of an entire New York newspaper. He was all instinct, big ideas, and creative chaos. Together, they made a pitch to Allied command that would have sounded, on paper, completely insane. What if the U.S. Army created a unit, a dedicated full-time deception unit that did nothing but lie to the German army. A unit that traveled up and down the front lines, putting on elaborate performances of fake military activity. A unit built not from the most hardened combat veterans, but from the most creative, inventive, unconventional minds in America. Remarkably, the top brass said yes. On January 20th, 1944, just 5 months before D-Day, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was officially activated at Camp Forest, Tennessee. And the recruiting process that followed was unlike anything the United States Army had ever attempted. They didn't want the best soldiers. They wanted the best artists. Recruiters fanned out to art schools across the Northeast. The Philadelphia Museum School of Art, the Art Students League in New York, design programs at major universities. Notices went up on bulletin boards advertising a vaguely worded assignment for a camouflage unit. No details, no specifics, just an invitation. Bernie Bluestein was 19 years old, studying at a Cleveland art college. When he saw one of those notices, he signed up because he wanted to serve his country, but, as he later put it, he wasn't exactly the fighter type. He had no idea what he was getting into. None of them did. They were building an army of artists, and they were going to send them to the most dangerous front lines in the world, armed with paint, rubber, and speakers, and almost nothing else. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable collections of human talent ever assembled in a military unit. Their average IQ was reported at 119, one of the highest in the entire U.S. Army. The unit included West Point graduates and advertising executives. It included engineers, architects, set designers, actors, radio broadcasters, and sound technicians. It included men who had worked in Hollywood and men who had designed for major New York fashion houses. And it included a handful of men who, though they didn't yet know it in 1944, were going to become legends of American culture. Bill Blass was a 20-year-old kid from Fort Wayne, Indiana, who had already won a major fashion design award before he was old enough to drink. He would go on to become one of the most celebrated fashion designers in American history. In 1944, he was in France, using his artistic instincts to figure out exactly how imperfect to make the camouflage on a rubber tank. Too perfect, and the Germans would know it was fake. Too careless, and they wouldn't believe it was real. Ellsworth Kelly was a young painter from Newburgh, New York, who had specifically requested assignment to the 603rd Camouflage Engineers because it was full of artists. His time with the Ghost Army, sketching and painting his way across Europe, would later be recognized as formative to his development as one of the defining figures of post-war American art. His minimalist, hard-edged paintings would hang in museums around the world. In 1944, he was sketching the bombed-out villages of France from a Jeep. Art Kane would become one of the most famous photographers of the 20th century, the man who assembled 57 jazz giants on a Harlem stoop for one of the most iconic photographs in music history. In 1944, he was a Ghost Army soldier helping to construct the visual architecture of a lie. These were not reluctant warriors. They were genuinely, enthusiastically invested in their mission, because their mission was, in essence, a creative challenge unlike anything any of them had ever faced. They weren't just soldiers, they were performers, and Europe was about to become their stage. The Ghost Army had 4 primary tools of deception. Each one was extraordinary in its own way. Together, they created an illusion so convincing It fooled the military intelligence apparatus of Nazi Germany repeatedly over the course of an entire year of active combat. The first weapon was the one that looked the most ridiculous up close and the most terrifying from above: inflatable tanks. Each inflatable tank was a 93-pound rubber replica of an M4 Sherman tank. Deflated, it could fit in the back of a Jeep. Inflated using gasoline-powered air compressors, it looked, from the air, from a distance, watched through binoculars, exactly like the real thing. But the Ghost Army artists understood something crucial. The Germans weren't just looking at shape, they were looking at behavior. They were looking for the subtle signs of genuine military activity. The way tanks leave tracks in soft ground. The way a real armored encampment looks slightly messy. The way camouflage nets sit imperfectly over real equipment because real soldiers are tired and hurrying and don't have the luxury of perfection. So the artist would deliberately leave a corner of a camouflage net askew. They'd use the unit's bulldozers to churn real tank tracks into the mud, leading from nowhere, going to nowhere, but looking absolutely authentic from a German reconnaissance aircraft at 5,000 feet. They'd position the inflatables at slightly different angles or different spacings so the formation looked organic rather than staged. The factory workers who manufactured the inflatables in Rhode Island were told they were being used as target practice decoys. A teenage girl named Teresa Ricard earned 49 cents an hour after school sewing them together, with no idea they'd end up fooling the Wehrmacht in France. The Ghost Army could set up an entire fake armored division, hundreds of vehicles, artillery pieces, command posts, supply depots, in a matter of hours. And at dawn, when German reconnaissance planes began their daily sweeps, they'd see what appeared to be a massive Allied armored force exactly where the Ghost Army wanted them to see it. The real units would have quietly moved 20 miles in the other direction. The second weapon was arguably the most technically impressive of the four. The Sonic Deception Unit, officially the 3132nd Signal Service Company Special, was built around a partnership with the engineers at Bell Laboratories, the most advanced audio research institution in the United States. Together, they created what amounted to the world's first battlefield sound studio. A team traveled to Fort Knox to record the sounds of genuine military activity: tank columns moving, infantry units marching, jeeps and trucks, artillery being deployed, the specific mechanical signatures of different vehicles, engineers building pontoon bridges, soldiers shouting commands. They captured everything, with painstaking precision, onto 16-inch glass transcription discs, the most advanced recording technology available at the time. And these recordings were then transported to Europe, where, for each new deception, the Ghost Army's sonic team would custom mix a soundtrack to match whatever illusion they were creating. An armored column moving north, mixed tank engine noise, infantry, occasional shouted commands, the clink of metal. A river crossing preparation, add the sound of boats, of heavy equipment, of bridge building crews. The mixed recordings were played back through massive amplifiers and speakers mounted on half-track vehicles. 500-pound speakers. Speakers so powerful that the sounds they produced were audible 15 miles away. 15 miles. German soldiers in forward positions would hear what sounded, unmistakably, like an entire army moving through the darkness. Tank engines, marching boots, the sounds of war. And they would report back to their commanders that a massive Allied force was approaching from the north, or the south, or the east. exactly where the Ghost Army wanted them to believe. At least one battle-fatigued German soldier, according to later accounts, began to hallucinate. He started to physically see tanks, even though he logically knew there were none. The sound was that convincing. The Ghost Army could make an army appear out of thin air. But what they could do to the radio waves was perhaps even more dangerous. The third weapon was the most invisible, and in some ways, the most sophisticated. Every military unit in World War II had a radio signature, a unique fingerprint of communication patterns, transmission frequencies, operator habits, and message timing that German signals intelligence had become extraordinarily skilled at reading. By monitoring Allied radio traffic, German intelligence could identify which units were where, how large they were, and often predict where they were going. The Ghost Army's radio operators, the 23rd Special Headquarters Company, were trained to impersonate those signatures. When the Ghost Army replaced a real unit, the real unit's radio operators would stay behind for 2 to 3 days, gradually transferring their communication patterns to their Ghost Army counterparts. The Ghost Army operators would practice the real operator's personal style, their speed, their rhythm, their particular way of sending Morse code. In the world of radio interception, individual operators were identifiable by feel, the same way you can identify someone's handwriting. Matching that fist, as they called it, was an art in itself. Once the transfer was complete, the real unit would go dark and move out. The Ghost Army operators would keep their traffic going, maintaining the fiction that the entire division was still exactly where it had been, doing exactly what it had been doing, while the actual soldiers repositioned hundreds of miles away. German signals intelligence, one of the most sophisticated in the world, was regularly fooled. The fourth weapon was the strangest of all, and in many ways the most human. They called it atmosphere, and it was exactly what it sounds like. When the Ghost Army needed to convince the Germans that a particular unit was present in a particular area, it wasn't enough to put up inflatable tanks and run sound trucks. Human beings talk. Local civilians interacted with soldiers. And in wartime France, there was always the possibility that a German spy, or a German sympathizer, or simply a curious local whose conversations were overheard by the wrong person, might report back information to the enemy. So the Ghost Army soldiers became actors. They wore counterfeit sleeve patches from whatever division they were impersonating. The 2nd Armored Division, the 6th Armored Division, whatever the operation required. They drove jeeps with the correct unit markings. They wore the right insignia, and they went into local bars, cafes, and restaurants, sat down, ordered drinks, and talked loudly, deliberately in character, about fictitious missions, fictitious movements, fictitious orders they had just received from their fictitious commanding officers. They assumed correctly that some of what was said would find its way back to German intelligence. That was the point. The entire performance was designed to be overheard. The Ghost Army's official history described their work as more theatrical than military. One of their officers wrote that it was like a traveling road show that went up and down the front lines impersonating the real fighting outfits. It was theater. It was espionage. It was performance art with the stakes of human lives. And now it was time to take that show on the road. On June 6, 1944, the largest seaborne invasion in history crashed onto the beaches of Normandy. More than 150,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel in a single day. The German Atlantic Wall, formidable as it was, cracked. 8 days later, 8 days after D-Day, the first elements of the Ghost Army arrived in France. Their initial mission was almost comically mundane compared to what would come. They were tasked with simulating a Mulberry Harbor, a portable artificial harbor the Allies were using to unload supplies on the beachhead. The Germans knew the Mulberry Harbors existed. They didn't know exactly where they all were. The Ghost Army lit up a section of coastline at night with specific lights intended to draw German artillery attention to a fake harbor location, away from the real one. It was hardly their most dramatic operation, but it worked, and it gave the unit its first taste of just how nerve-wracking the work would be. Because there was a fundamental terror built into what the Ghost Army did that no amount of artistic talent could fully prepare you for. They were bait. Every time the Ghost Army set up an elaborate fake military installation, a fake armored division, a fake command post, a fake bridgehead, they were specifically trying to attract German attention to that location. They wanted the Germans to see them. They wanted the Germans to believe they were a real, major military force. But they were 1,100 men with inflatable tanks and speakers. If the Germans looked closely enough, if any German unit decided to probe the division they'd identified on their maps, the Ghost Army had almost no ability to defend itself. They were 1,100 artists standing in a field, pretending to be 30,000 soldiers, and hoping the Germans never called their bluff. Whereas the Allied armies pushed out of Normandy and across France through the summer of 1944, the Ghost Army moved with them, a strange shadow force flowing behind the fighting front, appearing here, disappearing there, never quite where anyone expected. The operation at the besieged port city of Brest in late summer 1944 was the first time the Ghost Army deployed all three of its primary weapons simultaneously: visual, sonic, and radio deception working in concert. German forces held Brest in a defensive siege. Allied commanders needed to convince the German garrison that they were surrounded by a far larger force than actually existed, to pressure them into surrender without committing more real Allied troops to a potentially bloody siege. The Ghost Army inflated their tanks and vehicles around the city's perimeter. They ran their sound trucks through the night, broadcasting the audio signature of a massive armored force tightening the ring. Their radio operators transmitted traffic consistent with multiple full divisions, and their atmosphere teams worked the roads and villages nearby, spreading word of enormous Allied reinforcements. The German garrison, already under pressure, found themselves apparently facing an overwhelming force from multiple directions. Corporal Jack Macy, a Brooklyn kid who'd ended up in the Ghost Army somewhat by accident, later recalled Brest as the biggest piece of action he'd ever seen. Not because the Ghost Army was fighting, but because for the first time, he truly felt how close to the front lines they were, and how utterly vulnerable their illusion left them if anyone looked too hard. In September 1944, General George S. Patton was doing what Patton did best: attacking relentlessly, driving his Third Army toward the heavily fortified French city of Metz. And then his line broke open. A gap appeared in the American front, a section of line that was suddenly undefended, a hole that a German counterattack could pour through and potentially unravel Patton's entire offensive. A real division was on its way to fill the gap, but it would take time to arrive. And in wartime, a gap in the line is not something you can simply leave open and hope the enemy doesn't notice. The Ghost Army was called in to hold the line. For 7 days, 7 consecutive days, approximately 1,100 men with inflatable tanks, sound trucks, and radio equipment stood in the place of a full armored division and convinced the German army that the gap was not a gap at all. Their inflatables lined the positions a real division would have held. Their sound trucks ran around the clock. Their radio operators maintained the traffic pattern of a full divisional headquarters. The German forces in the area, apparently convinced by what their intelligence was showing them, did not press the attack. When the real division finally arrived to take up the position, they slid in behind the Ghost Army's illusion, and the Ghost Army quietly disappeared. Patton was briefed on what had happened. His reported response, according to those who were there, was something close to disbelief, followed by genuine admiration. Rick Beyer, who later made a documentary about the Ghost Army, noted that Patton was among the most enthusiastic and cooperative generals they worked with. He understood instinctively what they were doing. He made suggestions. He got it. Not all generals were so receptive. Some resented what they saw as theatrical nonsense when what they wanted was more men and more guns. The Ghost Army had to navigate throughout their entire deployment the skepticism of commanders who couldn't quite believe that 1,000 artists with rubber tanks could matter in a real war. Time and again, they proved otherwise. By early 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final chapter. Allied forces had fought through France, Belgium, the brutal winter of the Battle of the Bulge, and were now at the border of Germany itself. The Rhine River was the last major natural barrier before the industrial heartland of the Reich. Crossing the Rhine would require massive coordination, and the Germans knew it was coming. The actual crossing by the U.S. Ninth Army was planned for a specific point along the river. But if the Germans concentrated their defenses there, the crossing could become a catastrophe. Allied command needed to draw German forces to the wrong location. They called in the Ghost Army for what would become their most ambitious, most elaborate, and most successful operation of the entire war. Operation Viersen. The Ghost Army deployed to an area roughly 10 miles south of the actual planned crossing point. Over the course of several days, they inflated more than 600 dummy vehicles. They deployed their sound trucks to broadcast the sounds of an enormous river crossing operation being prepared. The specific sonic signatures of pontoon boats being assembled, heavy equipment being moved into position, bridge-building crews working through the night. Their radio operators transmitted traffic consistent with 2 full divisions, approximately 40,000 soldiers, preparing a major Rhine crossing at the decoy location. Their atmosphere teams were everywhere, in the local towns, in the farmhouses requisitioned as fake command posts, talking loudly about the enormous operation about to begin. The Germans bought it. German defensive forces concentrated at and near the decoy location, expecting the crossing to come from the south. The U.S. Ninth Army crossed the Rhine 10 miles to the north with dramatically less resistance than anyone had dared hope. The official history of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops later described Operation Viersen as their finest hour. An Army analyst who reviewed their missions after the war wrote, and this assessment has been cited repeatedly in the decades since, that rarely, if ever, has there been a group of such a few men which had so great an influence on the outcome of a major military campaign. 3 weeks after Operation Viersen, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. One of the strangest and most beautiful things about the Ghost Army is what its members did in between operations. They made art. Whenever there was downtime, and there was downtime, the peculiar, not eerie lull between deceptions, the artists of the Ghost Army pulled out their sketchbooks. They drew. They painted. They captured the bombed-out villages of Normandy, the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the medieval spires of Luxembourg rising above the ruins of the surrounding town, the faces of French farmers watching yet another army roll through their fields. Ellsworth Kelly filled sketchbooks. Bill Blass drew. Dozens of soldiers produced thousands of pieces of work. Personal visual records of a war seen through eyes trained to look at the world differently than most soldiers were equipped to do. The resulting archive is extraordinary. It is, in effect, a parallel visual history of the war. The same events, the same landscapes, the same devastation, rendered with an artist's attention to light, to composition, and to the human face of catastrophe. It is also deeply poignant because these are the works of men who could not, for decades, tell anyone what they had actually done while making them. A Ghost Army veteran could show his family a painting of a snow-covered village in Belgium. He could not tell them that he'd been there to make the German army think an entire division was camping in those woods, when in reality there were 200 men with rubber tanks and a sound truck. The art survived. The story stayed hidden. When the Ghost Army returned to the United States in July 1945, they were debriefed and given a set of orders that would define the next 50 years of their lives. Don't talk about it. Don't tell your family. Don't tell your friends. Don't write about it. Don't discuss it. On the techniques developed by the Ghost Army, the multi-channel deception methods, the sonic impersonation tactics, the radio signature mimicry might be needed again. In the early Cold War, with the Soviet Union emerging as a new adversary, the U.S. military did not want potential enemies to know what America was capable of in terms of battlefield deception. And so the men came home, took off their uniforms, and went back to their lives. Bill Blass went to New York and became a fashion legend. Ellsworth Kelly began his career as a painter. Art Kane started taking photographs. Hundreds of other Ghost Army veterans went into advertising, architecture, graphic design, illustration, teaching, the creative professions from which they had come. When anyone asked what they had done in the war, and people always asked, they said something vague, something modest. They had been in the service. They had been stationed in Europe. They had done their part. The sacrifice of silence is something we don't often talk about when we think about veterans. We honor those who were wounded, who lost comrades, who came home carrying visible scars. But there is also a kind of wound in being told that the most remarkable thing you ever did, the thing you risk your life for, the thing you are most proud of, must never be spoken. For 50 years, Ghost Army veterans grew old with their secret. Some of them died with it. 3 Ghost Army soldiers were killed in action. Dozens more were wounded. None of them, for half a century, could tell a single person what they had died for or what they had survived. In 1985, a Smithsonian Magazine article brought the first public hints of the Ghost Army's existence. The information was fragmentary, incomplete, still technically classified, but the story and the broad outlines of it began to seep into public awareness. In 1996, the records were officially declassified. The surviving Ghost Army veterans, now in their 70s and 80s, began to speak. For some of them, it was the first time in 5 decades they had told anyone the full truth of what they had done. Imagine that. Imagine carrying that story, that extraordinary, almost unbelievable story, for 50 years, and finally being allowed to tell it. In 2013, the filmmaker and author Rick Beyer produced a PBS documentary that introduced the Ghost Army to a mass audience. The response was overwhelming. People couldn't believe this story had been hidden for so long. In February 2022, the United States Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the nation's highest civilian honors, to the surviving members of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops and the 3,133rd Signal Service Company Special. President Biden signed the legislation into law. By that point, the youngest Ghost Army veterans were in their mid-90s. Most had already died. The ceremony was attended by a handful of survivors, men who had been teenagers and young men when they climbed out of landing craft in France in the summer of 1944. Finally, formally, officially recognized for what they had done. Now, the men who had fought with illusions were, at last, being seen. The Ghost Army saved, by conservative military estimates, between 15 and 30,000 American lives. They did it without heavy weapons, without armor, without the conventional instruments of military power. They did it with creativity, with intelligence, with the specific, peculiar, irreplaceable skills of people who had been trained to see the world as something that could be reimagined, recomposed, reframed, made to tell a different story than the one it was actually telling. There is something worth sitting with in that. In every war, in every conflict, the assumption is that the people with the most weapons, the most soldiers, the most raw military power will win. History is full of cases where that assumption proved wrong, where a smaller, cleverer, a more creative force found a way to defeat a larger one by changing the terms of the contest. The Ghost Army changed the terms of the contest, and they did it by being, essentially, the world's most dangerous theater company. Their story was kept secret for 50 years. In those 50 years, many of the men who lived it never received a single word of public recognition. They died unacknowledged, their contributions invisible to the history books that recorded the war they helped win. They deserve to be remembered, not just for the lives they saved, but for what their story tells us about what human beings are capable of, about the kind of intelligence that doesn't show up on a battlefield in the form of firepower, but shows up in the form of imagination. If this is the kind of story that makes you want to understand the Second World War a little more deeply, the hidden stories, the secret units, the untold chapters of the most consequential conflict in modern history, then subscribe. This is what we do here. Drop a comment below. Before watching this, had you ever heard of the Ghost Army? I read every single one.